Have you ever thought about how a dream can completely change your life? What if that dream isn't just a vision of the future, but the fuel for something grand and unexpected? Joseph, a young dreamer, had two dreams that changed his life forever. And these dreams were not just a glimpse into the future, but the key to a destiny he never imagined. But what happens when life takes an unexpected turn that feels impossible to handle? Joseph had the opportunity to rule an empire, but this didn't happen because he was lucky or because the path was easy. No, Joseph went from the depths of despair to the glory of a palace. And at every step, he faced obstacles that could have destroyed his faith. He was betrayed, thrown into prison, and yet in the end became the second most powerful man in Egypt. But what did Joseph do to overcome all of this? How did he turn each adversity into an opportunity? Today, you will learn about the 6 great blessings Joseph received in Egypt and how each one was a testament to God's faithfulness. No matter what you are facing, the story of Joseph can teach you that even in the darkest moments, God has a purpose for your life. Together, let's discover how God even used prison to bring Joseph to the palace. Welcome to the Curious Bible channel. Be sure to subscribe now and activate notifications so you don't miss any biblical curiosities. Joseph, the young dreamer, never imagined that his own brothers, who had always been his childhood companions, would become his tormentors. He had dreams, big dreams, and he believed those dreams were signs of something grand that God had for him. But what he didn't know was that by sharing his dreams, he was planting the seeds of anger and jealousy in his brothers' hearts. His eyes sparkled with a vision of the future, but the reality was much harsher. His brothers, despite trying to hide it, couldn't help but notice the special attention Joseph received from their father, Jacob. This favorable relationship was one of the reasons they began to harbor such hatred toward him. It was as if Joseph was a constant reminder that he held a special place in Jacob's heart, and this only fueled the resentment of his brothers. Joseph's dream, in which he saw himself as a leader, seemed like a slap in the face to those who had always lived in the shadow of the youngest. It was as if Joseph, without meaning to, had poured salt on the wounds of his older brother's insecurities. The tension grew, and the hatred of his brothers became palpable. They could no longer see Joseph as the youngest brother who always had a good relationship with their father, but as a threat. They wanted to get rid of him, no matter what. So, when they saw Joseph approaching the field on his solitary journey, anger took over. A plan for revenge began to form in their minds. Joseph's fate was about to be sealed in a cruel way. The initial idea of killing him was discussed coldly, as if it were the simplest solution to their problem. But something inside Reuben, the oldest brother, made him suggest an alternative. "Let's just throw him into a pit," he proposed, perhaps thinking this would solve the problem while still leaving the possibility of rescuing Joseph later. Although Reuben's intention was softer than the others, he was still participating in a plan of betrayal that would change Joseph's life forever. And Joseph, so innocent and full of faith, was about to be thrown into a pit of darkness, not understanding what was happening around him. Joseph, still in his naivety, didn't know what awaited him. When he reached his brothers, they attacked him with brutality. They stripped him of his coat of many colors, which to Joseph represented his father's love, and threw him into the bottom of the dry pit. The sound of his coat being torn echoed in Joseph's mind like a warning that his life was about to change forever. He was left there, not knowing what to do, not understanding why his own brothers had betrayed him so cruelly. The pain of abandonment and the uncertainty about the future consumed him, and at that moment he began to question his own dreams. What was God doing? He had been betrayed so cruelly, and all he knew was that he was alone. But in that pit, where the darkness seemed to swallow his soul, Joseph didn't know that a much greater force was at work. God was preparing Joseph for something much bigger than he could imagine. The adversity he was experiencing at that moment, the abandonment and pain, would be the lessons that would shape him for what was to come. Joseph's story was just beginning, and he didn't yet know that what seemed to be the end of his dreams was actually the beginning of something grand. God had not abandoned him, and this test of faith would mark a milestone in his journey. Meanwhile, the brothers were making decisions that would change the course of history. After deliberating about what to do with Joseph, they opted for a more humane solution and sold him to passing Ishmaelite merchants. The price of his sale was the bitterest betrayal he had ever experienced. But for the brothers, it was a convenient solution. Joseph, unknowingly, was being taken to Egypt, a totally unfamiliar land, where everything he knew would be challenged. Though Joseph's destiny had taken an unexpected turn, he was about to discover that the stones in his path were being used by God to build a solid foundation for something much greater. Joseph's journey was just beginning, and the adversities that seemed to be his greatest enemies would become the springboard for the fulfillment of dreams he hadn't even imagined were possible. But what Joseph didn't yet know was that his journey had only just begun. From the depths of the pit, he would be taken to a strange land filled with challenges. He didn't know it, but his life was about to take a turn that would take him from prisoner to ruler. What seemed like the end was, in fact, the beginning of a great transformation. Joseph's story was about to become one of the most powerful lessons of faith, overcoming and trust in God. But can you imagine what it's like to be sold by your own brothers and sent to an unknown land? And even more, how could this be part of God's bigger plan? Get ready, because in this video, the unexpected path that will turn Joseph's suffering into something extraordinary will be revealed. Stay tuned. When the Ishmaelite merchants took Joseph to Egypt, he had no idea how difficult life as a foreigner in that land could be. Joseph was sold as a slave, something unthinkable for a young man who, until that moment, had lived in a comfortable home, loved and admired by his father. The pain of separation was deep, but the feeling of being lost in an unknown place, far from his family and everything he knew, was even more devastating. However, Joseph was not alone. God never left him, and although loneliness and uncertainty seemed to overwhelm him, he clung to his faith. Something deep and silent in his heart told him that his story was not over and that he was not there by accident. He was bought by Potiphar, an official of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, and a man of great influence in Egypt. Potiphar owned many slaves and lands, but he did not know that he was about to acquire one of the greatest assets of his life without even realizing the value of what he was gaining. Joseph arrived with nothing, a young soul marked by pain and loss, but with an invincible spirit. At first, Joseph was just another slave, performing the simplest and heaviest tasks. But over time, something began to happen. Joseph had a rare skill, something that made him stand out even in the midst of darkness. A sharp mind, an uncommon ability to organize and manage, and a confidence that reflected his relationship with God. Even in the humblest tasks, he gave his all, and his work began to shine. He knew that, no matter how difficult his situation was, he had something inside him that no one could take away: his dignity and his faith. Joseph's story is a lesson in perseverance and trust. Even though he was treated as property, with no rights or dignity, he did not give in to despair. He found strength in the faith he had in God. He refused to be defined by external circumstances. He knew that his worth was not in the clothes he wore or the position he held, but in God's purpose for his life. And no matter how chaotic everything around him seemed, Joseph continued to work with excellence. He demonstrated a remarkable ability to turn adversity into an opportunity, and this was soon noticed by Potiphar. Potiphar then began to realize that Joseph was different. With every task he completed, Joseph did more than expected. He did not just fulfill the tasks, but exceeded expectations. The captain of the guard saw that wherever Joseph was, God's blessing seemed to be present. This caused Potiphar to entrust him with even greater responsibilities. Joseph was no longer just a slave. He had become the overseer of Potiphar's entire household. Everything he touched prospered, the Bible says. Potiphar, who had once looked at Joseph only as a servant, began to trust him completely. He entrusted Joseph with managing all his assets, finances, and even the most important decisions of the household. But at the same time, Joseph's life seemed to improve. A great test of character was about to emerge. Potiphar had a wife, and over time, she began to look at Joseph differently. Joseph, with his attractive appearance and charisma, caught the attention of Potiphar's wife. She then began to make advances toward him. However, Joseph, with a strong character and unwavering faith, resisted any temptation. He knew that more than being loyal to his master, he was called to be faithful to God. The temptation was great, but what he knew in his heart was even greater. His obedience to God came above everything. Joseph understood that resisting was not just a moral choice, but a commitment to the divine purpose in his life. One hot afternoon, while everyone in the house was away, Potiphar's wife made a final attempt to seduce Joseph. She grabbed him by his cloak and tried to make him lie with her. Joseph quickly fled the scene, leaving the cloak in her hands. It was not enough for the woman to be rejected by Joseph. She was furious. Desperate to cover up her shame, she screamed and accused Joseph of attempting to assault her. When Potiphar returned home and heard the story, he had no choice but to imprison Joseph, for his wife's words seemed final. Even Potiphar, who trusted Joseph, could do nothing to prevent the young man's imprisonment. Joseph was once again thrown into a dark place, now in prison, where he would stay for many years. Life seemed once again to treat him cruelly, but Joseph's story would not end there. Even in prison, Joseph did not lose his faith, and God was once again with him. Joseph had learned a crucial lesson, that even in the most difficult moments, God never abandons him. His faith was strengthened, and his trust in God became even firmer. In prison, he began to realize that no matter where he was, God always had a purpose for his life. Although prison was a place of suffering, God had begun to make Joseph's light shine even brighter, even in the shadows of the dungeon. In every situation Joseph was involved in, he used it to serve with excellence, and this began to be noticed by others. But Joseph's true transformation was just beginning, and what seemed like a final obstacle would become the door to the greatest blessing of his life. Soon Joseph would have a new opportunity to show his gift and character. What he didn't know was that inside the prison he would find the key to his future in Egypt. Can you imagine what it would be like to be unjustly accused and thrown into prison, even after doing everything right? What if I told you that it was in this dark place that Joseph found the key to completely change his life? Keep watching, because what comes next reveals the most surprising moment of this incredible story. In prison, Joseph found himself in an even darker and more difficult situation. This was not just another trial in his life, but an environment filled with despair and isolation. However, for someone who had already faced so many adversities, the prison did not have the power to defeat him. He knew that God's presence was with him, and this deep knowledge was the strength that sustained him. Joseph was not there merely to survive, but to fulfill a purpose that was still beyond his understanding. He knew that even in that place, God had a plan for his life, and with this in mind, he remained firm and resilient. As the days went by, Joseph did not let despair consume him, and his attitude was what made the difference. He stood out among the other prisoners and soon gained the trust of the prison guards. His organized nature, leadership skills, and positive attitude began to show in everything he did. He started to take responsibility for the management of the prisoners and various tasks in the prison, as though he were managing a large estate. Joseph knew that regardless of the circumstances, he should do everything with excellence, for that was what pleased God. It was in this context that God placed two important figures in his path, the Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker. Both had been imprisoned for reasons unknown to Joseph, but soon they became key players in the divine plan for his life. The cupbearer and baker were deeply troubled, for they had both experienced enigmatic dreams and did not know how to interpret them. In the ancient Egyptian culture, dreams were considered divine messages, and the Pharaoh often relied on dream interpreters to understand the signs the spiritual world sent. Joseph, with the wisdom God had given him, noticed the distress on the faces of the two men and approached them to understand what was happening. The cupbearer, anxious, shared his dream with Joseph, a vine with 3 branches that sprouted and produced ripe grapes. He squeezed the grapes and handed them to the Pharaoh. The baker, in turn, told his dream. 3 baskets of bread were on his head, but birds came and ate the bread from the top basket. Both were distressed, not knowing what these dreams meant. With the wisdom God had granted him, Joseph listened attentively to their stories and confidently made the interpretations. For the cupbearer, Joseph explained that within 3 days, he would be restored to his position of trust in the Pharaoh's palace. He would be released from prison and return to serve the Pharaoh. For the baker, however, the interpretation was grim. He would not escape death, for within 3 days he would be hanged as punishment for his mistakes. Joseph then made a request of the cupbearer. When he was freed, he should remember him and speak to the Pharaoh about his situation, for he was still unjustly imprisoned. When the 3 days passed, Joseph's prophecies were fulfilled exactly as he had said. The cupbearer was released and restored to his position, but for the baker, the outcome was fatal. He was hanged, just as Joseph had interpreted. However, the cupbearer, who had promised to remember Joseph, forgot him. After being reinstated in his position, he went on with his life in the palace without even mentioning Joseph's name to the Pharaoh, leaving the young prisoner waiting, unaware that his moment of liberation was approaching. Joseph remained in prison for 2 more long years, still trusting in God, but also questioning why he had not yet been freed. He could have become bitter, but instead he maintained the unwavering faith he had always had. During this time, he continued to serve with excellence, showing that his faith in God did not depend on the circumstances, but on his commitment to divine faithfulness. The waiting period was not easy, but God was shaping Joseph, preparing him for the great opportunity that was about to come. Although the cupbearer had forgotten about Joseph, the moment of his redemption was about to arrive. The Pharaoh, disturbed by an enigmatic dream that no one could interpret, led the cupbearer to remember Joseph, the young man who had accurately interpreted his own dreams years earlier. Joseph's life was about to change forever. And though he was still in prison, the moment he had been waiting for was finally coming. Destiny, which seemed relentless, was beginning to align the pieces for something much greater. Joseph, imprisoned and forgotten, kept his faith. But what happens when destiny finally takes a turn? He believed in a greater plan. But was his waiting worth it? Get ready, because what comes next will reveal how even the darkest moments can prepare us for something grand. Stay tuned. And don't forget to comment at the end of the video. Your opinion is very important. The Pharaoh, king of Egypt, spent a restless night, disturbed by a dream that left him deeply unsettled. He dreamt of 7 fat, robust and well-fed cows emerging from the Nile River and grazing joyfully by its banks. But soon after, 7 thin, weak and sickly-looking cows appeared from the same river and devoured the fat cows. When he awoke, Pharaoh was completely confused and alarmed. The dream was vivid, but it made no sense. He tried in vain to understand the meaning of the disturbing vision, but found no plausible explanation. Desperate, he summoned all the wise men, magicians, and diviners of Egypt, but to his frustration, none of them were able to interpret the dream satisfactorily. Pharaoh was consumed with anxiety, feeling that something grand and threatening was about to happen, but he couldn't understand the message the dream was trying to convey. It was then, like a light at the end of the tunnel, that the cupbearer, who had been restored to his position 2 years earlier, remembered Joseph. He recalled the Hebrew prisoner who, with wisdom and precision, had interpreted his own dreams and the baker's dreams while they were in prison. The cupbearer knew that Joseph, a man blessed by God, might have the answer to Pharaoh's riddle. He quickly approached Pharaoh and told him the story of how Joseph had interpreted their dreams in an extraordinary way. Pharaoh, curious and desperate for an answer, immediately ordered that Joseph be brought to him. Joseph was brought from the prison, and despite all his suffering, his appearance reflected a man who still possessed unshakable dignity. He was no longer the young dreamer from his father's house, nor the humiliated slave in Potiphar's house. He was now a man who had experienced God's presence in deep and transformative ways. When he arrived at the palace, Pharaoh, still troubled, shared his dream, hoping that Joseph could bring clarity to his troubled mind. Joseph, calm and confident, explained that the dream was not just a senseless vision, but a divine message. He said that the 7 fat cows represented 7 years of great prosperity and abundance for Egypt, while the 7 thin and weakened cows symbolized 7 years of famine and scarcity that would follow. Joseph, with impressive wisdom, told Pharaoh that the key to avoiding the crisis was to prepare properly during the years of abundance. It was necessary to store food during the 7 years of plenty to ensure that the country would survive the coming drought and scarcity. Pharaoh, impressed by the depth of the interpretation and the wisdom of Joseph, saw in him a man of God. He recognized that Joseph possessed discernment that no one else in Egypt had. "There is no one as wise as you," said Pharaoh, and immediately made a bold decision. Joseph was appointed as second in command over all of Egypt, given authority over the entire administration of the country. He was given a new name, Zaphenath-Paneah, and a wife, the daughter of the priest of On, placing him in a position of honor and respect. Joseph, who had once been a mere slave and prisoner, was now the governor of Egypt, a man of great power and influence. With this, Joseph not only fulfilled the mission that God had for him, but he was also placed in a strategic position to save Egypt and many other nations from the coming famine. Joseph's transformation from slave to ruler was a clear testimony to God's sovereignty over his life. However, the true test of Joseph's leadership was only just beginning. He would have to make difficult choices and decisions of great weight during the years of plenty, and his wisdom would be tested in ways he had never imagined. Now, Joseph was at the peak of his power and influence, but the challenges were far from over. What seemed like the fulfillment of his dreams, both in prison and in Potiphar's house, was just the beginning of an even more remarkable journey. During the years of abundance, Joseph would have to lead diligently, make tough decisions, and keep his trust in God. But the greatest test of his faith and character was still to come. Soon, Joseph's own brothers, those who had sold him into slavery, would come to Egypt in search of help. At that moment, the true test of forgiveness and reconciliation would be put before him, and the story that began with hatred and betrayal was now nearing its dramatic climax. Imagine having the power to save an entire nation, but also being confronted with the greatest test of your life. Joseph went from prisoner to governor in the blink of an eye, but what comes next will be even more surprising. Stay with me to discover what happens when redemption meets forgiveness. Joseph's life in Egypt seemed finally stable. He held a position of great authority and honor, respected by all. During the 7 years of abundance, Joseph worked tirelessly to store grain and prepare Egypt for the coming years of famine. He was at peace with himself, knowing he had fulfilled God's will. However, his faith would be tested in a way he had never imagined. The years of famine finally arrived. A great drought struck not only Egypt, but the entire region. The lands surrounding Egypt suffered from a shortage of food, and people from many places began to travel to Egypt in search of food. When Joseph's brothers, who lived in Canaan, heard that there was grain in Egypt, they made a difficult decision. They would go there in search of food. They did not know that, by making this decision, they were crossing paths with Joseph, the brother they had sold into slavery many years before. When the 10 brothers arrived in Egypt and presented themselves to Joseph, they did not recognize him. He was now dressed as an Egyptian ruler with a demeanor and authority they would never have imagined. Furthermore, time and distance had altered his appearance, making him unrecognizable to them. Joseph, on the other hand, knew exactly who they were. His heart tightened as he saw them, but he showed no emotion. Instead, he confronted them harshly. He accused them of being spies and asked why they were in Egypt. The brothers, nervous and frightened, explained that they had come to buy grain for their family, unaware that they were standing before their own brother. Joseph then put them to the test. He knew this was an opportunity not only to test his brothers, but also to assess how much they had changed. He decided to detain them and ordered one of the brothers to be imprisoned, while the others would return home with food, with the condition that they returned to Egypt with the youngest brother, Benjamin, as proof of their honesty. Joseph's proposal caused great distress among the brothers. They began to remember the evil they had committed against him years ago and started to believe that they were being punished for their past actions. In a moment of desperation, Reuben, the oldest brother, tried to intervene, saying, "Didn't I tell you not to harm our brother? Now we are paying the price for our wickedness." Joseph listened in silence, but his heart was heavy. He knew this was his chance to see if his brothers had truly repented for what they had done. After much reluctance, the brothers returned to Canaan, carrying with them the grain needed to survive the famine. When they arrived, they told their father what had happened and reported Joseph's demands. Old Jacob, now fearful of losing Benjamin as well, hesitated to let him go, but given the circumstances, he was forced to consent. What he didn't know was that this was the moment God had prepared for reconciliation. The tension was palpable. Joseph's brothers, now carrying a heavy guilt, returned to Egypt with Benjamin in tow. Joseph was on the brink of revealing his true identity, but the right moment had not yet arrived. The situation was about to take an unexpected turn, and the final great test of forgiveness and redemption was approaching. How would Joseph handle his brothers, now so remorseful, in light of his own success and power? The fate of everyone was about to be sealed. Don't leave the screen just yet. There's something you need to know. Joseph's brothers traveled once again to Egypt, with Benjamin by their side, hoping to obtain more grain. The famine was ravaging the land, and there was no other option. They knew this was their last chance to save their families. However, what they did not expect was that they were about to face a definitive test, the greatest of all: Joseph's forgiveness and true reconciliation. When they arrived at Joseph's palace, fear overtook them. They did not know what to expect, especially after everything that had happened the last time. They humbly presented themselves before Joseph, fearing he would accuse them once again. But instead, Joseph greeted them with a mysterious smile, and as usual, led them to his private room. The moment arrived, and Joseph could no longer contain his emotions. He stepped forward and, in a low voice, said, "I am Joseph, your brother." A deadly silence filled the room. The brothers were in shock, unable to believe what they were hearing. The man they had despised, sold as a slave, was standing before them in a position of great power. There was no denying the truth anymore. Joseph's dream had come true. He was the second most powerful man in Egypt. The brothers' reaction was one of pure terror. They feared that Joseph, now with authority, would seek revenge for the cruelty with which they had treated him years before. They bowed before him, fearing the worst. However, Joseph did not respond with anger or bitterness. Instead, he said, something the brothers would never forget. Do not worry, it was not you who sent me here, but God, to save lives. He knew that, despite human wickedness, God's hand had guided every step of his journey. Joseph explained to his brothers that, through the adversities he faced, God had set his plan into motion to save not only his family, but many others. The famine would not be a disaster for all, because Egypt, thanks to Joseph's planning, had an abundance of food. But more than that, God had allowed him to become a blessing to his brothers and family who were about to be saved. Upon hearing these words, Joseph's brothers began to cry. They were deeply remorseful for everything they had done. For years, the weight of their betrayal had consumed them, and now, in the presence of Joseph's goodness, they found themselves forgiven in a way they had never imagined. Joseph embraced them and forgave them, saying, God turned evil into good, and today our family will be restored. Joseph's forgiveness brought immense relief to his brothers' hearts, but the true restoration of the family was only just beginning. Joseph knew his journey was not yet complete. The reunion with his father, Jacob, awaited, and he needed to prepare everything to receive his family in Egypt. It was the beginning of a new phase, but also a great challenge. The reunion with his father would be the final step in sealing the reconciliation and restoring the lost family bonds. But what more would come? The fate of Joseph's family would take a new direction, and many surprises still awaited. But you will only know that if you stay here with us. After revealing his identity and granting forgiveness to his brothers, Joseph wasted no time. He knew that the greatest blessing of all was still to come, the moment of reuniting with his father Jacob and finally restoring the family's unity. The news that Joseph was alive and in a position of power in Egypt quickly reached Canaan, and the joy among the relatives was immense. However, Jacob, now an elderly man, was skeptical and uncertain. He could not believe that the son he had lost many years ago was still alive and that he would have the chance to see him again. Joseph, knowing that this moment would be crucial for his father's heart, made preparations. He sent chariots and riches to bring Jacob and all his family to Egypt. Joseph's brothers, now aware of the magnitude of what was happening, were happy but also anxious. Would their father forgive them completely for the betrayal? They knew that the burden of guilt Jacob had carried all that time weighed heavily on him. What would Jacob do when he found out that his sons were responsible for so much pain in his life? When the chariots arrived in Canaan, Jacob was surprised to see all the grandeur and wealth. He did not understand immediately, but when his sons told him the truth, his reaction was a mixture of disbelief and joy. Jacob could not believe it, but the voices of his sons and the signs of riches began to convince him that the impossible was happening. He began to cry, and his tears were of relief, confusion, but also of gratitude. Finally, Jacob agreed to travel to Egypt, though with a heavy heart. The journey, which would be long and tiring, was marked by anticipation. The old patriarch knew that this could be the last great reunion of his life. Upon arriving in Egypt, he saw Joseph from a distance, and the two embraced, crying non-stop. Joseph, the beloved son, the man who had been thought dead, was now before him, not only alive, but with a transformed life. Jacob, with a choked voice, said, "Now I can die in peace, for I have seen my son who was lost." This moment of deep emotion was the culmination of Joseph's journey. He was not only reuniting with his family, but bringing healing to wounds that had remained open for years. The forgiveness had restored his relationship with his brothers, but also healed his father's heart, who could finally rest and see God's blessing in his life. Joseph, now at peace, invited his entire family to settle in Egypt, offering them the land of Goshen, which was the best in the country. Jacob's family would prosper there, and God's blessing would continue to manifest in their lives. There was no longer room for vengeance, only for forgiveness and reconciliation. What seemed like the end of a story of betrayal and pain was, in fact, the beginning of a new era for Jacob's family, marked by blessing and the presence of God. Although Joseph's forgiveness had restored the family bonds, God's purpose for his life was still being fulfilled. Egypt would become a place of great prosperity for Jacob's family, but it would also be a setting for the fulfillment of divine promises that would extend to future generations. Joseph's story was far from over. What was in store for him and his descendants? The fate of an entire nation was about to change forever. Joseph's life in Egypt was not just a story of personal triumph, but also of legacy and destiny fulfilled. When Joseph invited his family to settle in Goshen, Egypt, many might have thought his story was nearing its end. But in reality, it was only just beginning. What God had started years earlier with Joseph's dreams and his betrayal by his brothers was now coming to fruition in an entire nation. Joseph's story not only impacted his family, but was pivotal in the fulfillment of God's promises. To Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, after reuniting with his father, Joseph settled with his family in Goshen, the best land in Egypt. The future seemed promising, but Joseph knew there was still much to be done. Egypt, under Pharaoh's reign, was prospering on a grand scale, but the price of prosperity was high. While things were good, Joseph did not forget that God had plans for him and his family that went beyond mere survival. He knew that God's purpose was much deeper. As time passed, the years went by, and Joseph's life in Egypt became an example of faith, wisdom, and governance. Joseph had children with Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, and through his children, Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph not only reconnected his name to the promise made to his father, Jacob, but also continued the lineage of the patriarchs, passing on to his children the faith in a sovereign God who could transform any situation of suffering into a blessing. Joseph's story had a profound impact on his people. When the great patriarch Jacob died, Joseph had the honor of being responsible for his burial in Canaan, at the same place where the other patriarchs were buried. During this ceremony, Joseph reaffirmed his faith and trust in God, knowing that, even after his death, God would still have a plan for his family and descendants. He asked his brothers that when the time of liberation from Egypt came, they would carry his bones with them, for he believed that God would bring them back to the Promised Land. Joseph's great legacy was the fulfillment of the promise God made to Abraham, that his descendants would become a great nation. Although Egypt was a place of prosperity, the promised land of Canaan was the final destination for the children of Israel. And while Joseph governed Egypt, he held onto the faith that God would not forget his promise, even when the years of prosperity in Egypt ended, and that one day his descendants would be freed from slavery, and that is exactly what happened. Many years after Joseph's death, the people of Israel were oppressed in Egypt. And just as Joseph had foreseen, God freed them under the leadership of Moses, guiding them to the promised land. Even after his death, Joseph was still remembered as the man who had the vision, wisdom, and courage to turn a great adversity into a blessing for his family, Egypt, and all future generations of Israel. The legacy of Joseph teaches us that, even in the most difficult situations, when evil seems to prevail, God has a purpose. Joseph's suffering from from his brother's betrayal to his unjust imprisonment, was not in vain. Every step of his journey was part of a divine plan, which not only led him to a place of power in Egypt, but also brought salvation and prosperity to his entire family. Joseph is a clear example of how faith, patience, and trust in God can transform adversity into opportunity. Joseph's life is not just a story of success, but a testimony of how God can make us instruments of blessing, even when the path seems difficult. So what did you think of this incredible journey of faith and perseverance of Joseph? You can't deny the power of God in transforming every adversity into an opportunity for blessing, right? If you like this story and want to see more content like this, don't forget to like, share with your friends, and of course, subscribe to the channel to stay up to date with all the news. And before you go, leave a comment. Which moment of Joseph's story impacted you the most? I'd love to know your thoughts. See you in the next video. Until then.